We must break down barriers between provinces so that all Canadians have full access to our resources. Above all, in a divided world, we must rely more on each other.
We had a couple federal ministers, along with the Prime Minister, great ideas about internal trade, that we're going to knock down those barriers and we're going to expedite that.
Can interprovincial trade barriers be dealt with, wiped away in 30 days?
The short answer to your question is yes.
As you can hear there's a national push underway to shore up this country's economic independence from the United States, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gathering premiers today to discuss breaking down interprovincial trade barriers ahead of a weekend trade mission to Europe, where he's set for some so-called friendshoring with like-minded trading partners. But with a Liberal leadership race underway, opposition parties that have vowed to bring this government down as soon as possible, and just a one-month reprieve from Trump's tariffs, are these latest economic efforts likely to succeed? Let's bring in our front bench to talk about that. Sharon Carr is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. She's now a partner at Sovereign Advisory. She's right in the middle there. Jamie Ellerton, we're going to head out of studio. We're missing you in studio. Jamie is a conservative strategist and the founding partner of Canaptus Limited. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Belanger is here on the left there. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And next to me, that's Marika Welsh. She's a senior political reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. I could add to internal trade, Marika, and say everyone's now apparently a big fan of pipelines. Like, a lot has happened in the past 2 days.
Energy corridors is the
right.
euphemism.
I'm so sorry. My apologies. I guess I just wonder, like, is this for real, do you think?
I mean, I feel in no sense that it is until it's not. We kind of went through this with the first Trump administration, right? We were talking about diversifying trade then. We were talking about looking elsewhere for our economic strength or to grow our economy. I think there is this focus now, but you laid out all the barriers to why it maybe won't happen in 30 days and why it could be delayed, and the political landscape could be so different in 3 months. It's hard to actually see how the machinery of government would actually focus on addressing those regulations right now.
Yeah, maybe turning it into action, but even the political sort of coalescing of thought, Sharon, has been something to witness, because even if you look at both Mark Carney, we'll talk about this in a moment, and Chrystia Freeland put their economic policies out today, so much of it has to do with this idea of independence in some way or accessing new markets, particularly where energy is concerned. I mean, half the time I'm listening to Liberal ministers now, it sounds like something the Conservatives would have said 4 years ago on pipelines, so there's not that big disparity anymore there. Like, is that only because of Trump? And do you think it lasts even, let's say they can't get something done in a month, even throughout his term, just because of all the uncertainty?
Well, I think it's going to last for now, as long as it's a hot topic with him. But it's taken President Trump threatening tariffs for our politicians of all stripes to actually care about, say, interprovincial trade and pipelines. We saw, for example, Premier Legault said diversification of everything is on the table, which, felt like PTSD for me, considering I worked on Energy East and Keystone XL. And I remember trying to get Energy East through Quebec, and then after he came out and said, no pipelines, no Energy East through Quebec. So I'm not really hopeful, because I think everyone is reacting to what Trump is saying and not realizing that means they actually have to do something domestically, and trying to change regulations, trying to work with the provinces to get anything done. On top of that, you've got people and activism and voters and all this stuff. Nothing is going to get done, and it's a little scary to see that now everyone's kind of jumping to say, let's do it, and using the same talking points. But I'm not really hopeful about
Although they are saying, let's do it, which is something different than, there were more differences in the way that the parties were positioning themselves previously. I just want to play that clip. I think we have one of the clips, correct me if I'm wrong, in the control room, from Quebec's Premier François Legault, who was asked about essentially diversifying markets in something like Energy East or a pipeline of that nature. Let's take a listen.
If there is or not some tariffs, we need to have diversification of markets. So it includes working better with other provinces, but also with Europe, with other countries than U.S.
He did at one point, though, also get specifically asked Carl about Energy East and said there remains, no social acceptance for it.
Quebec remains a société distincte, so, as long as your barriers are coming down, we're fine with that. I mean, like, for example, French requirement, right? If you think Quebec is going to forego any French requirements to allow more goods coming from other provinces in Quebec. Vous pouvez toujours rêver, les amis. Ça arrivera pas. So there are things that are very political that each premier is going to have to deal with. Like each province is facing lobbies that are not really open to some of these free trade agreements within the country, and that's why those exceptions are in place in the 2017 free trade agreement. So there's political will, but there's going to be political resistance. So 30 days seems a bit of a utopia right now.
Yeah, the timeline is, I agree, very, very difficult for anyone to navigate real change through. Jamie, there might be political will right now, but in order for it to be sustained, usually requires public pressure. And I think like the one thing that has jumped out to me, and I'm curious to see what you think, is not only has there been like a coalescing of thought around a lot of things in the political class, but people who call into my radio show are asking questions about why all of our oil goes to the United States. They weren't necessarily thinking about that, why there are these barriers that amount to a 21% tariff, essentially, existing between provinces. So they're interested, and they are very aware of what's happening with Donald Trump. Might that make the difference in the medium to long term?
Yeah, I kind of share Sharon's point of view right now in terms of kind of not being so optimistic about it. I think if you're a political leader right now, you know, to your point, Vassy, what you're hearing from your listeners on your radio show, that there's a real desire for Canada to do things differently, that something needs to change. I don't think there's really a political consensus there. Like, oh, we need to do something is kind of where this consensus falls apart. Like Premier Doug Ford just a few months ago ripped up a contract the LCBO signed with a Quebec supplier for paper bags of all things and said it had to be an Ontario supplier. And so there's so much internal friction and inertia on all of this to actually come together when it comes time to actually putting real details on the table and saying, here's what we're going to do. That's where the disagreement is going to stop. And I think when you look at the reality right now that Parliament is still shuttered, no one really has a mandate to kind of enact on this change. I think genuinely that Pierre Poilievre is probably the only leader right now actually talking with a kind of tone for persuasion that's starting to lay out a detailed plan and kind of bring the Canadian people along with him. This government is a total lame duck government. The next tariff threat in the beginning of March is still going to have this Parliament shuttered while the Liberal Party is figuring out its own internal affairs as to who's ultimately going to be Prime Minister for a hot minute. And when you actually get into the details of this, it's so much work actually needs to be done. And so I'm really not optimistic now. I think they're taking the easy way out by saying, yeah, we need to do something, and it's buying them some time, but details are scarce.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, Marika, that we're kind of in this weird position here federally, particularly. But they are, and we're going to talk about this later too. But they are taught, like, it's not. Pierre Poilievre is talking about what he would do, but so is Chrystia Freeland today, so is Mark Carney, to be in this moment, certainly about the direction they would take the government. It's just that we don't know who the heck in 2 months will be the government.
Yeah. Or how many times it will change. How many prime ministers will we have?
Or what
in the
tariffs
next
will be
2 or 3
there,
months?
or what,
Yeah, exactly. And the challenge is like manyfold, but the first challenge, I think, is that the next Trump deadline comes when Justin Trudeau is still the prime minister. And will what he said about the border actually be in place if Parliament isn't sitting to pass the laws that the government has said are needed to change it? So there's all these hurdles still to come. But it is incredibly striking for somebody like Chrystia Freeland to today talk about championing liquefied natural gas exports when I know you've done a gajillion interviews with the Liberal ministers trying to understand why that wasn't spurred in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they said there's no market. So there is like a huge disconnect between what we're hearing now, in particular from the Liberals and Liberal leadership candidates, and also government ministers, frankly, than there was, say, 4 months ago.
What do you think about that, Sharon?
I think that's completely the case. It's like, what is the actual need and what's true? Like, they did say, like, we're not going to do LNG because, yes, we don't have the market need. There actually is, if you look at the global market need, if we were to open it up. But now we've kind of come down to a bit of this individual, provincial, I would say, protectionism of its own. Like, we're here trying to make Canada whole and have our own protectionist approach, but now you have all the provinces. And it's one thing to say that we're going to do LNG. It's one thing to say we're going to diversify because we're trying to react back to Trump. But the second they have to react back to the voters, when they forget about Trump, it's just going to be at 350. Because, like, we haven't built a pipeline in Lord knows how long. And again, I say that as a
we built TMX. It just cost 30. I think you were there when your minister bought it.
And in fairness, we took that from Kinder Morgan and kind of went from it. Yes, but like, look at the headache that went through. We have to identify ourselves as a country that is willing to maximize our own resources at a certain point if we do want to not run into these issues where we have someone down south who doesn't operate like a normal politician and will do anything on a whim.
But isn't he, Carl, the kind of only opening for parties that have talked about all the drawbacks of doing exactly what Sharon has talked about? Isn't he the sort of reason that they can change their tune and not, appear to abandon a constituency of voters that put them in office?
Well, it's all about where the voters are going, though, right? Because if a party opens a door that usually previously was closed, it means that for another party, you have an opening to fight that. And so, the people are not fully on board with suddenly building pipelines everywhere. Like some people are, because they realize the threat from the United States and how you could be a little more sovereign with your own energy. But a lot of people are saying, we don't need that. We just need more electric cars. Bring in the Chinese cars. Remove those tariffs, right? Solutions abound.
Nothing's changed in just 6 months. So we were all like, yeah, put those tariffs on the Chinese cars.
So the key thing is, all of this is feeding a narrative of change on the federal political scene, right? And who's best positioned to capture that narrative and capture the minds and hearts of voters? In the case of Chrystia Freeland, came with some of proposals today that are fitting that narrative. She was there for the past 11 years in charge. And
a number of years as finance minister.
Exactly. So, on that front, advantage Carney, and then, on the bigger front, advantage Poilievre, unless you are able to convince voters that you are the real change.
Okay.